Nearly half a century ago, on a cold, rainy night in Olympia, Washington, Evelyn Hartley, a young 27-year-old woman, left her home and never returned. The porch light stayed on all night, the cup of tea still warm on the table, but the owner of the house vanished like she dissolved into thin air. Police scoured the forests along Capitol Lake, dove into the streams, combed every meter of land, but found no trace whatsoever, only a heavy silence enveloping the small city. Years passed, the case was filed as cold, witnesses died, evidence was forgotten, and the name Evelyn Hartley gradually became a whisper from the past, until a young investigator accidentally discovered an old piece of evidence in the archives, something that would revive the mystery that had seemed dormant for nearly half a century, and force the entire Olympia community to confront a horrifying truth. On Friday evening, October 12, 1974, Olympia was immersed in a persistent light rain. On the small streets leading to Capitol Lake, the yellowish streetlights cast down onto the water, reflecting the shadows of people hurrying home. In the office building of Pacific Mutual Insurance Company, Evelyn Hartley, 27 years old, finished packing the last stack of files before turning off the lights and leaving. She was remembered by colleagues as a careful, quiet woman, living alone in a small house on Lake Fair Drive, about 10 minutes' drive from downtown Olympia. That afternoon, Evelyn told her coworker that she would cook a simple dinner and pick up her sister Margaret Reed to join her for the meal. On the way home, Evelyn stopped by the small grocery store called Simmons Market at the corner. The store owner clearly remembered the young woman in a blue raincoat, buying a bottle of milk, a few canned goods, and a bunch of white tulips, their mother's favorite flower when she was alive. It was around 5:40 p.m. After that, Evelyn got into her silver Ford Pinto, the car she had bought just over a year ago, and drove toward the residential area near the lake. Around 7 p.m., the neighbor next door, Mrs. Nora Blake, saw Evelyn standing on the porch, seemingly fumbling for her keys. The light from the porch lamp illuminated her face, then she turned away as the rain began to pour harder. That was also the last time anyone saw Evelyn Hartley. By after 8 p.m., the rain was still falling relentlessly. In that small house, the living room light was still on, and the radio in the kitchen was still playing the evening news program. Margaret, who was at her apartment a few blocks away, called her sister as planned, but the phone rang endlessly, with no one picking up. She thought Evelyn might be taking a bath or had forgotten the phone. 10 minutes later, she called again. Still silence. Sensing something was wrong, Margaret put on her coat and drove to her sister's house in the cold rain. When she arrived, the dashboard clock read 9:10 p.m. The front door was ajar. Light spilled out from inside, the soup pot still on the stove, the steam now cold. On the dining table, 2 place settings were laid out, next to the bunch of white tulips still wrapped in paper. Margaret called out her sister's name loudly, the echo fading in the empty house. There were no signs of a struggle or robbery, but everything seemed frozen midway. Evelyn's raincoat hung on the hook, her wet shoes still placed by the door, and the car keys were missing. Margaret walked around the backyard, calling over to the neighbors' houses, but no one had seen her sister leave. She drove around the neighborhood, past the lakeside road, where the lights shone down on the grayish water. There was no sign of the silver Pinto, no fresh tire tracks, just the heavy rain washing everything away. By 10:45 p.m., Margaret returned to the house in a state of trembling and confusion. She knew Evelyn couldn't have just left like that, especially with the meal still unfinished. She stepped to the landline phone, her hands shaking from the cold and fear, then dialed the Olympia Police Department. The first report was logged that rainy night, a woman missing, last seen right at her own home. Outside, the rain still fell steadily, washing away the tiny traces that no one had time to notice would become the first pieces of a case that would last nearly half a century. When the Olympia Police Department dispatcher received Margaret Reed's call, the clock was nearly 11 p.m. Her voice was trembling, halting. "My sister is gone. The door's open, lights on, but she's not home." Immediately after, a patrol car was dispatched to Lake Fair Drive, the quiet lakeside neighborhood, dotted with a few houses amid the rain. The headlights swept over the puddles, the light reflecting off the windows of house number 217, where Evelyn Hartley lived alone. Officers Tom Garland and Richard Mills arrived first. They saw the sister standing at the door, soaked through, eyes red-rimmed. The small house was lit up, strangely warm amid the rainy night. Everything was tidy, but there was no sign of life. In the kitchen, the soup pot was cold. Two half-set place settings. The wall clock was stopped at 7:12 p.m. On the table, the bunch of white tulips lay tilted, a few petals crushed. Garland checked each door. No signs of forced entry. Floors clean. No strange footprints. The back door was ajar, rain splashing onto the wooden floor. Under the fence, there was a faint shoe print, blurred by water. Margaret recounted that Evelyn had called her at noon, arranging dinner. When she arrived, the lights were still on, the radio still playing, but her sister's car wasn't parked in the yard. Evelyn didn't have the habit of going out at night, let alone in the rain and wind. If she went anywhere, she would definitely leave a note. The statement made the two officers understand it was no ordinary departure. At 11:30 p.m., Police Chief David Rourke was called in. The experienced man stepped into the house, observing every detail: door open, lights on, meal unfinished, and the complete absence of the homeowner. He ordered the scene photographed and evidence collected around the house. The faint shoe print in the backyard was noted, though the rain had nearly erased it. There were no signs of forced intrusion, but the open back door made them suspect Evelyn had let someone in herself. In the bedroom, the wallet and driver's license were still there. On the vanity, the watch, ring, and purse were intact. Only the Ford Pinto car keys were missing. This detail made Rourke note it boldly in his notebook. If she had left the house with the car, then where might she be on the road? At midnight, the police expanded the search around the neighborhood. Flashlights swept through the paths to the lake, illuminating every bush. No skid marks, no fresh tire tracks. The on-duty radio confirmed no accidents in the area. The traffic accident hypothesis was temporarily ruled out. Meanwhile, Margaret sat on a kitchen chair, clutching a soaked woolen scarf tightly in her hands. A female officer asked more about her sister's habits, friends, colleagues, recent acquaintances. Evelyn lived reclusively, no romantic relationships, just a few friends at the office. Margaret recalled, lately her sister had mentioned receiving a few wrong number calls late at night. She hadn't paid attention, but now that detail seemed suspicious. The police recorded it fully in the report. Around 1 a.m., the rain let up. The forensics unit arrived to assist, collecting fingerprints from the door handles, dining table, water glasses, and a few small wet items on the porch. Everything was sealed in evidence bags. The house was cordoned off that night, yellow tape strung around the fence. Rourke ordered the file opened as missing person, high risk. He requested patrol teams to check the parking lots around Capitol Lake and the route leading to Highway 101. Results were still negative. No signs, no witnesses, no sounds, except the rain and wind blowing through the roof. Before leaving the scene, Rourke instructed Margaret to come to the police station the next morning to give a detailed statement and provide photos of her sister. He looked around the house one last time, everything frozen in the rhythm of everyday life, just missing one person. At 1:45 a.m., the first report was sent back to headquarters. Female 27 years old, missing from her own home, suspicious circumstances. Investigation open. The patrol car left Lake Fair Drive, leaving the flashing red lights reflecting on the wet road. The rain still fell lightly, gradually erasing the tire tracks, as if hiding every trace of the night that began a case no one expected would last nearly half a century. On the morning of October 13, 1974, Olympia was still wet and cold after the night's rain. Capitol Lake was covered in white mist, the wind carrying damp air, and the smell of wet earth. From 7 a.m., Police Chief David Rourke was at the scene, directing an emergency meeting. Evelyn Hartley's disappearance was classified as high risk, no signs of voluntary departure, no witnesses, no note. He mobilized the entire force in the county. 3 search directions were deployed right that morning, around the Lake Fair Drive neighborhood, along the route Evelyn took to work, and the Capitol Lake, Tumwater Falls Park area. The K-9 unit from Thurston County joined with over 40 police, firefighters and volunteers. Missing, Evelyn Hartley, 27 years old, brown hair, blue eyes. Flyers were printed overnight and posted on every utility pole, bus stop, and store. Around 8 a.m., The K-9 began tracking from Evelyn's coat. 2 dogs circled the backyard, then stopped at the lakeside fence, where the scent faded. Rourke expanded the search radius to 3 miles, including the sparse forest and lakeside trails. Every position was marked and reported hourly. At 9 a.m., Olympia radio station KGY broadcast the official announcement: a 27-year-old Olympia woman, missing since last night, at Lake Fair Drive. The news spread quickly throughout the city. Many residents volunteered, bringing flashlights, raincoats, and splitting up to search around the lake. Small groups quietly moved through the wet grass, calling Evelyn's name amid the thin fog. By noon, the South Lake search team found a piece of green fabric, caught on a low branch, matching the color of the raincoat Evelyn wore that evening. The fabric was collected, sealed, and sent for analysis. Not far away, a park employee reported seeing slow-moving car lights around the wooden bridge at about 7 p.m., but no license plate. The police noted every detail, even if vague. In the afternoon, the number of participants grew to over 100. They divided to comb every vacant lot, forest patch, and lake shore. A group of divers checked the water near the wooden bridge, but the strong current made searching difficult. 3 hours later, they surfaced with a few harmless items: a rusted soda can, floating plastic pieces, nothing related to Evelyn. Another police team checked the route Evelyn usually took to work. They stopped at gas stations, coffee shops, small motels, but no one had seen her silver Ford Pinto. No security cameras, no witnesses. The investigation felt like searching for a needle in the dark. On the second day, the search radius was extended another 5 miles south. The K-9 was brought back to the scene. 1 dog stopped at the Hartley's back gate, barked lightly, then circled, losing the scent. Rourke had a flag planted to mark the spot and noted the location. Other teams swept around Percival Creek, the connector from Capitol Lake to Highway 101. Muddy ground, no tire tracks, no items belonging to Evelyn. At noon, the water rescue team continued scanning with small boats. Cold, murky water, swift currents, but they persisted. After hours, nothing of value was found. A sudden rain shower forced a pause. Still, no one left. Olympia residents brought hot coffee and sandwiches for support. The atmosphere was heavy but full of hope. On the third day, Rourke held a short meeting at headquarters. Results were still zero. He ordered a recomb of the entire area around the house, taking statements from neighbors and Simmons Market staff, where Evelyn had stopped shopping the previous evening. Everyone said she left the store around 6 p.m., with no one accompanying her. A few remembered a gray car driving slowly through the neighborhood, but couldn't describe the driver. All was recorded, not enough to open a new lead. That evening, the local TV news aired Evelyn's photo with the caption, "Have you seen her?" The reporter stood in front of the small house, against a gray sky, reporting amid the whistling wind. Olympia residents fell silent. The young woman, a familiar face in the office and grocery store, now the center of a missing persons bulletin. On the fourth day, the search narrowed. Only police teams and a few volunteers left. They re-scanned the lake area one last time, shining lights along the water's edge, looking for tire tracks around the trails. Everything passed in futility. Night fell. Rourke sat in the patrol car, looking at the lake shrouded in white mist, eerily quiet. No concrete evidence, no reason for disappearance, just the lit house amid the damp streets, and unanswered questions. On the fifth day's afternoon, after over 200 hours of searching, the operation officially ended. Rourke wrote the final line in the log: "No results. Continue desk investigation." The patrol cars left Lake Fair Drive, red lights reflecting on the wet road. Residents returned home, but the uneasy feeling lingered in the air. Margaret stood alone on her sister's porch, holding Evelyn's photo. Light rain fell, wind blowing through the trees, drawing out scattered sounds. Across the lake, the last lights of the search team faded. The whole city sank into silence, the silence of worry, of unnamed loss, and of a disappearance no one expected would become a mystery spanning decades. After nearly a week of fruitless searching, the police shifted focus to verifying witnesses. On the morning of October 18, 1974, Sheriff David Rourke met the investigative team at the Olympia headquarters. On the board was a map of Evelyn Hartley's usual route from Pacific Mutual Insurance to home, along Capitol Way, over the small bridge near Capitol Lake, then turning onto Lake Fair Drive. The distance was only a few miles, but she had vanished without a trace. The first point checked was Simmons Market Grocery Store. The owner, Mrs. Martha Simmons, remembered Evelyn stopping by to buy milk, canned goods, and tulips around 5:40 p.m. She was cheerful, nothing unusual, she said. Said she was going home to cook dinner with her sister. She also confirmed Evelyn was wearing a blue raincoat, carrying a brown paper bag, and left alone. This could have been the last time anyone saw her. Another witness, Henry Lowe, a newspaper delivery boy near Capitol Lake, said that around 6:45 he saw a woman in a light raincoat walking over the bridge, with a build similar to Evelyn's. It was raining heavily, and he only caught a glimpse under the car lights. The statement matched the time frame of her leaving the store and approaching home, pinpointing 6:45, 7 p.m. as the time of her disappearance. From the statements, police reconstructed her final route, leaving Simmons Market, crossing the bridge, driving along the lakeside road toward home. But no one saw her silver Ford Pinto. Gas stations, diners and roadside shops all answered no. No cameras, no tire tracks, everything empty. In the afternoon, a new witness emerged. Leo Kramer, a delivery truck driver. He reported that at 7 p.m., while driving past a stretch about half a mile from Evelyn's home, he saw a small car parked on the shoulder with headlights on. Two people were standing near the front, one man, one woman. The heavy rain prevented him from stopping, but he remembered the car was light-colored. After reading the missing person report, he connected the dots and came forward. The statement was considered the first significant lead. Police returned to the area, examining the roadside dirt, finding a few faint tire marks in the mud, but not enough to identify. A park maintenance worker also reported that night, seeing car lights moving slowly around the bridge, like the driver wasn't familiar with the road. Everything pointed to a narrow area, the small road connecting from the bridge to Lake Fair Drive. Rourke had a timeline chart created. 5:40 p.m. Evelyn leaves Simmons Market. 6:45. Witness sees woman walking over the bridge. 7 o'clock. Suspicious car appears near the victim's home. After that, complete silence. No one saw her, nor the car again. Investigators posed two possibilities. Evelyn stopped to talk to an acquaintance, or was lured away by a stranger. No signs of struggle at home, so the first possibility was weighed more heavily. Police combed through lists of acquaintances, colleagues, and close neighbors. Only one name came up: Robert Kelton, living 2 houses away, who had helped her fix plumbing the previous summer. When questioned, he said he knew nothing, only heard a car drive by around 7:30 p.m. The statement was simple, unremarkable. The scant evidence pieced together painted a hazy picture of Evelyn's journey. She finished work, stopped at the store, drove home via the bridge, possibly stopped near home. The brief 10 minutes between 6:45 and 7 p.m. became an unsolvable gap. Police ruled out no possibilities, but had no foothold to advance. On the afternoon of October 19, Rourke and the team returned to the scene one last time. Cold wind blew across the lake, old rain streaks still imprinted on the road. He looked at the map pinned with red marks, each pin a statement, each statement a dead end. The road Evelyn took daily, peaceful and short, now became the boundary between normal and mystery. As night fell, Rourke sat in the patrol car in front of her house, watching lights reflect on puddles. Olympia remained as quiet as if nothing had happened, but he knew, somewhere along that route, someone had seen and stayed silent. In the days following the compilation of statements, the search for Evelyn Hartley made no progress. No silver Ford Pinto was found, no new witnesses, no clear traces. As time passed, the chances of finding her alive grew increasingly slim. On the morning of October 20, 1974, Sheriff David Rourke issued an order to expand the search radius. Water rescue teams and volunteers were mobilized to Capitol Lake. The lake was divided into small sections for diving checks. They worked for hours, finding only mud and debris. On shore, police swept along rows of trees, shining lights for personal items. No results. Another group scoured the route where Leo Kramer reported seeing the suspicious car. Tire marks on the ground had been nearly erased by rain, unable to determine the vehicle type. Homes along Lake Fair Drive were all door-knocked, but residents heard or saw nothing unusual. Olympia remained quiet, as if no disappearance had just occurred. Margaret Reed was present almost every day. She carried her sister's photo, walking the neighborhood, asking anyone who saw Evelyn to report to police. Her photo was published in the Olympian newspaper and on KGY radio, with the word missing. On Margaret's face was exhaustion, but she didn't give up. The search force dwindled. Many volunteers had to return to work, leaving only police and a few relatives. Rourke tried to keep spirits up for the team, but he himself felt the deadlock spreading. In his report, he wrote briefly, "No new signs. Possibility victim was taken out of Olympia." Police sent notices to neighboring counties, expanding checks to Tacoma and Seattle. All abandoned vehicles were cross-checked by license plates, but no matches. The hotline received dozens of misidentification calls. Some claimed to have seen Evelyn at a bus stop, but none matched the description. On the 10th day, Rourke ordered the operation scaled back. The dive team ended their task. The area around Percival Creek was swept one last time. Nothing found. The only evidence retained was a Pall Mall cigarette butt found behind Evelyn's garden. It was sealed and stored in the evidence locker, unusable at the time, due to limited technology. Media continued coverage, newspapers calling it Olympia's most mysterious disappearance. Many theories emerged: kidnapping, accident, or voluntary departure. Family refuted. Evelyn would never leave like that. She loved her job and lived disciplined. The local community still followed, but hope began to fade. By late October, autumn rain returned, covering all traces. Search activities were forced to stop. Police shifted to desk investigation, reviewing personal records, colleagues, friends. No one had conflicts or motives to harm her. Evelyn lived quietly, kindly, most said. On November 1st, after more than 2 weeks, Rourke signed the report ending the operation. No results. Case transferred to long-term investigation. He knew he had just closed the only phase with any hope. That evening, he stood on the bridge, looking at the pitch-black lake surface, fog enveloping everything. The sound of falling water steady, cold and empty. A woman vanished right in the middle of a small city. No clues, no answers. In Olympia's darkness, only the solitary light spilling from her house remained, reminding everyone that sometimes the most horrific things don't come from far away, but from the familiar peace of their own midst. After the search operation ended, Evelyn Hartley's disappearance nearly fell into silence. Everything at a standstill, no evidence, no witnesses, no investigative direction. But Sheriff David Rourke couldn't yet set it aside. Among the few pieces of evidence collected, only one Pall Mall cigarette butt found at the fence behind her house. He believed, though small, it could be the final piece. The butt was discovered on the Monday morning after Evelyn vanished, lying on the damp ground near the wooden gate to the lake. At the time, police only thought it might have been discarded by a passerby, but Rourke still ordered it sealed. In 1974, no DNA techniques, fingerprints on such a small item, couldn't be used. The sample was placed in a plastic bag, coded 14A, and stored in the evidence locker. In the log, he noted briefly, "Origin undetermined, retained for testing if needed." A few days later, Rourke ordered a re-sweep of the area around the fence, hoping to find more related traces. The crime scene tech team examined the ground, grass, drainage pipes, but found nothing new. No one in Evelyn's family smoked, and neighbors around the house confirmed that too. She hated the smell of cigarettes, Mrs. Nora Blake, next-door neighbor, affirmed. If so, this cigarette could only belong to a stranger who had been very close to the house on the night she disappeared. Rourke reasoned that this person might have waited for Evelyn in the backyard or approached from the lakeside. He had lists of smokers living around Lake Fair Drive, scanned, especially those with minor criminal records, but results led nowhere. Olympia had thousands of Pall Mall smokers, and no one had connecting evidence. The investigation gradually stalled. Police sent the sample file to the state forensics lab, but technology then wasn't advanced enough for deep analysis. Everything stopped at storage. In his personal notebook, Rourke wrote, "Possibility of a second person in the backyard, unidentified." That note became the final point in the field operations log for the case. Time passed, remaining efforts also quieted. The Hartley family still kept in touch with police, holding faint hope for new news. Margaret lit the porch light every night, believing her sister would find her way back, and Rourke, every time he looked at the thick file on his desk, still felt something unclear. He kept a personal copy of the scene log, and a photo of the cigarette butt. In November 1974, the case was transferred to the unsolved missing category. The file labeled inactive, stored in the basement steel cabinet, but Work still occasionally reopened it, rereading every line of notes. He knew this wasn't a voluntary departure. A young woman couldn't vanish just because of rain. The only evidence, the cigarette butt, was a sign that someone had been there, very close to her, very real. The following year, when Work retired, he handed over the file to his successor, but still advised, "Don't throw it away. One day we might know." At that time, no one imagined that one day would be nearly half a century later. That winter, Olympia sank into fog and cold rain. Evelyn's house stood empty, the porch light still on every night as habit. For police, the case closed, but in the old evidence locker, the plastic bag coded 14A lay still, waiting for a time when science could do what people then couldn't, tell the story that only it knew. After the winter of 1974, Evelyn Hartley's disappearance quickly sank into silence. No additional clues, no new witnesses. The silver Ford Pinto still vanished, as if it never existed. When Sheriff David Rourke retired the following year, the case file was transferred to the Olympia Police Department's archives. On the faded brown cover spine, only the line remained: Hartley, Evelyn missing, 1974. Time flowed, Olympia changed, neighborhoods expanded. The wooden bridge over Capitol Lake was replaced with a concrete one, and Lake Fair Drive became bustling. But in the memory of old-timers, the disappearance remained an unhealed wound, a mystery no one mentioned, but no one forgot. In the 1980s, police reopened the file upon discovering a woman's body near Tumwater Falls, but autopsy showed it wasn't Evelyn. The case closed again. The only sample, the Pall Mall butt, remained intact in the sealed plastic bag. At that time, DNA testing didn't exist yet, the evidence nearly useless. The Hartley family lived in the void. Margaret Reed, Evelyn's sister, married and moved to Tacoma, but returned to Olympia every year. On the anniversary of her sister's disappearance, she lit the old house's porch light, placed a bunch of tulips, the flowers her sister had bought that afternoon. Elderly neighbor Nora Blake still kept the house key for her, whispering, "The house is too quiet," but like it's still waiting for someone. By the 1990s, as DNA technology began developing, many old cases were reopened, but Evelyn's remained dormant. No suspects, no comparison samples. In the 1998 archive log, only one note: sample 14A, seal intact. No one thought that small line would become important later. In 2000, Washington's Cold Case Review Program was established, reviewing old files. A young investigator named Alan Mercer was assigned to check Olympia's storage. Opening the cabinet, he saw the yellowed old plastic bag, inside the cigarette butt, and a handwritten note: "Work, keep for the future." Mercer noted it, but budget wasn't enough for DNA testing. The file was shelved again, just adding pending in the corner. And so Evelyn's case became town folklore. Kids called her Empty House, the missing girl's house. Local papers occasionally recalled the case in Olympia Mysteries columns, printing alongside Evelyn's old photo, the brown-haired girl, with blue eyes and a gentle smile. And for Margaret, hope never extinguished. She often sent letters to Olympia police, asking, "Do they still have my sister's file?" And the answer was always the same: "It's still here, intact." Those letters were stored with the old file, like an extension of an unfinished case. In the early 2010s, as forensic genealogy emerged, police departments nationwide began matching crime scene DNA with public genealogy databases. Many seemingly hopeless cases were solved. When reviewing old files in Olympia, a tech spotted Evelyn Hartley's case had an untested biological sample. The line 14A, Pall Mall cigarette butt, was underlined in red, moved to the priority testing list. Nearly half a century had passed since the rainy night of 1974. Olympia had changed, most witnesses gone, but in the old basement, that faded plastic bag lay still. It waited for someone patient enough, and technology advanced enough to awaken the secret dormant. For 46 years, the secret of the woman who vanished right in the heart of the peaceful city. From after Evelyn Hartley's file was transferred to the priority review list, time still passed quietly. Olympia entered new decades, changing daily. While the 1974 disappearance gradually became a distant memory of an old generation. New residents knew almost nothing, only occasionally hearing someone mention the girl who disappeared by Capitol Lake. For many it was no longer a case, but a rainy night story, sad, vague, and haunting. Evelyn's old house still stood there, weathered wooden walls, overgrown lawn. Every spring, Margaret Reed returned from Tacoma, swept the porch, replaced the old bulb still lit every night. She was over 60, hair streaked with white, but still believed one day someone would find the truth. No miracle needed, she once told a reporter, just someone who still remembers my sister. Over the years, young investigators took turns inventorying cold files. They read quickly then refiled, because the Hartley case had nothing to pursue. The only sample, the 14A cigarette butt, remained in the preservation freezer, seal intact. No one wanted to discard it, but no one knew what to do with it. DNA technology had advanced far, but the cost and procedures to analyze such an ancient sample were too high for a small local department like Olympia's budget. By the mid-2010s, the city had changed almost completely. Capitol Lake got walking paths, lakeside cafes sprouted, tourists strolled unaware this was once a disappearance scene. In papers, new cases took front pages. Evelyn Hartley's name existed only in digital archives, but in the chilly basement of the police station, that small evidence box lay there, silent, waiting for time to answer. Occasionally when new investigative teams came on duty, they reopened storage, glancing at the old sealed plastic bags. A young investigator, Sergeant Lisa Monroe, once said she lingered long before the Hartley file. Something different, a completely clean disappearance, not a single extraneous detail, and perhaps that emptiness makes it unforgettable. She photographed the file cover, uploaded to the digital system, marked Needs Review. No one expected that small action would later become the starting point for major change. In Tacoma, Margaret still maintained contact with Olympia police. Occasionally she called to check, anything new? The answer was usually still not yet, but her persistence reminded people the file still had someone waiting, and within the department, Evelyn Hartley's name wasn't completely forgotten. Entering 2020, America exploded with cases solved by forensic genealogy, tracing biological relatives of suspects via public genealogy data. Cases buried for decades were revived. Forensics labs in Washington state began reviewing lists of long-stored biological samples. On that list, Olympia's 14A code was marked in red, possible DNA extraction, and like a closed circle, what was once deemed meaningless, nearly half a century ago now became new hope. The story thought ended began shifting slowly. In Olympia, the old porch light of Evelyn's house still shone, reflecting on the damp cold lake surface. No one knew that just a little while longer, from that small forgotten piece of evidence, the secret of 1974 would awaken, and time would stop being silent. In March 2021, during the inventory of files for the Washington Cold Case Initiative program, investigator Lisa Monroe returned to the old evidence room of the Olympia Police Department. Amid the dusty file boxes, she spotted a small box labeled Hartley Evelyn, 1974. On the lid was still the handwriting of Sheriff David Rourke, evidence 14A Pall Mall cigarette filter, keep for the future. Monroe decided to reopen that specimen, sending it to the state lab for DNA testing using modern technology. The specimen was handled carefully, with a section of the inner paper fibers cut from the filter. After nearly half a century, it was still dry, perfectly preserved. The lab used YSTR amplification technique, allowing the separation of male DNA from the tiny specimen. 2 weeks later, the results stunned the entire team. A complete DNA sequence was recovered. Although it did not match any profiles in the National CODIS system, Monroe did not stop there. She proposed sending the sample to Othram Inc. lab in Texas, a unit specializing in forensic genealogy that had solved many cold cases. In May, the DNA was analyzed, uploaded to the Family Tree DNA and GED match databases. The system showed that this sample was genetically related to 3 people living in the state of Oregon, 2 women and 1 man, all second-degree relatives of the sample's owner. From there, genealogists built the family tree, scouring every branch, tracing clues to men who had lived in Washington in the 1970s. After 2 months, they narrowed it down to a lineage originating in Yakima County, and one name stood out: Harold Hal Whitmore, born in 1949, who had lived in Olympia right in the year Evelyn disappeared. Whitmore was a freelance plumber who had worked around the Lake Fair Drive area, where Evelyn lived. According to residents' records, he left Olympia just a few weeks after October 1974, moving to Oregon and then Idaho, where he died in 2004 from lung disease. Monroe immediately requested a DNA comparison, coordinating with the Oregon Forensics Agency to obtain a tissue sample still preserved from his hospital records. In September 2021, the results were confirmed. The DNA from the Pall Mall cigarette filter matched Harold Whitmore's DNA completely. After 47 years, the Olympia police finally had the identity of the man who had appeared in Evelyn's backyard on the night she disappeared. The investigators reviewed the old files and discovered many suspicious details. Whitmore had once been noted for a minor disturbance, but not prosecuted, lived alone, and had a habit of smoking Pall Malls, matching the specimen. A 1973 archival photo showed him wearing a dark green jacket, tall and thin, similar to the faint description provided by witness Leo Kramer, a man standing with a woman next to a light-colored car near the lake. From there the police pieced together the case picture. Whitmore may have come to Evelyn's house that night, under the pretext of acquaintance from a previous plumbing job. She was not wary, opened the door to talk, and disappeared. Afterward, he left the cigarette in the yard, then left Olympia forever. No one suspected that an ordinary plumber could be involved in that shocking disappearance. Monroe's report was presented to the commander and immediately approved to reopen the file. On October 12, 2021, exactly 47 years since Evelyn disappeared, the Olympia Police Department announced the reinvestigation of the case. The news spread quickly. The Olympian newspaper headlined, "Cold Case 1974, DNA identifies suspect after 47 years." Olympia residents were stunned. For the generation that lived through that time, the name Evelyn Hartley returned like a collective memory, awakened after half a century. Although Whitmore had died in 2004, identifying him was still a major breakthrough. The police continued to search the places he had lived, the rented lands, the filled wells, hoping to find traces of Evelyn. For them the case was not over. There was still one unanswered question: where is she? The DNA evidence could not tell the whole story, but it had done what people could not 47 years ago: return to Olympia a name, and to the Hartley family, a hope that finally, the darkness of that rainy night in 1974, was gradually being illuminated. When the DNA comparison results confirmed Harold Hal Whitmore as the person who left the Pall Mall cigarette filter behind Evelyn Hartley's house, the Olympia Police Department entered the deepest investigation phase since 1974. Investigator Lisa Monroe, in charge of the case, understood that identifying the DNA was only the beginning. They needed to prove why this man was at the scene, and whether he was directly involved in Evelyn's disappearance. To do that, Monroe, along with forensic specialist Dr. Alan Seaver, conducted a reanalysis of all the old preserved specimens. The Washington State Crime Lab used next-generation sequencing technology, next-generation sequencing, to extract the entire genetic map from the cigarette sample and compare it with Whitmore's DNA from Oregon medical records. The results not only matched at the identification level, but also aligned 99.98% in 23 independent genetic loci, an almost absolute confirmation. However, Monroe needed more than a number. She wanted evidence to reinforce that this DNA not only was near, but belonged to the person who directly interacted with Evelyn on the night she disappeared. Therefore, the technical team attempted to reconstruct the mixed micro-DNA analysis to see if the filter could still hold traces of a second DNA, possibly belonging to the victim. After many hours of processing using ultrafine sample filtration technique, microtrace extraction, they detected a weak amount of female DNA, matching Evelyn's DNA profile, preserved from a hair sample her mother submitted to police in 1974. That meant Evelyn had been very close to Whitmore at the time the cigarette was smoked, most likely right in the home grounds. This discovery silenced the entire lab. After nearly half a century, they finally had evidence that the suspect had truly made direct contact with the victim before she disappeared. Monroe immediately reported the results to the commander and transferred the file to the Washington State Legal Department. The experts assessed, although Whitmore was dead, the DNA evidence was strong enough to affirm him as the sole suspect present at the scene before the victim disappeared. This basis allowed expanding the investigation scope to all areas Whitmore had lived after 1974. But DNA did not just identify identity, it also recounted habits. Through deep analyses, the forensics team found nicotine and tobacco resin markers, indicating the cigarette had been smoked to the end, meaning the smoker was there long enough, possibly waiting for someone. Soot stuck to damp soil suggested he was standing outdoors, possibly next to the back fence. That image matched the old speculation of Sheriff Rourke. Years ago, the second person appeared in the backyard. From the new data, Monroe reconstructed the timeline model of the night of October 12, 1974, 6:45 p.m. Evelyn was seen crossing the bridge. 7 p.m. A witness saw a light-colored car stop near the house. 7:10 p.m. Whitmore may have been waiting in the backyard, smoking before she returned. This arrangement made the lured by acquaintance hypothesis more reasonable than any other. To strengthen the file, Monroe requested Digital Forensic Services to rescan all 1974 photos and minutes, converting them to digital format for analysis by artificial intelligence. The system detected a detail never noticed before. In a photo of the back gate, there was a faint shoe print, size 11, matching the shoe size in Whitmore's old military records. Combined with the DNA and shoe data, the scene picture became clearer than ever. The final report was completed in November 2021. In it, Monroe concluded, the physical and biological evidence all point to Harold Whitmore as the sole person present at the scene at the time the victim disappeared. The victim's DNA sample, found on the suspect's personal item, confirms direct contact. The scientific correlation level meets the criminal conclusion threshold. The news was announced on November 15. For the first time after 47 years, the authorities declared Evelyn Hartley's disappearance case had a suspect identified by biological evidence. The press called it a turning point of late justice, but for Monroe, the greater meaning lay in one simple thing. Finally, the small cigarette filter that Rourke had kept with the note "Keep for the future" had truly fulfilled its mission. And from that DNA result, a new chapter opened. The most important chapter of the investigation, finding out where Evelyn went, and what really happened on that rainy night in 1974. When the DNA report affirmed Harold Whitmore as the person who left traces at the scene, the Olympia Police Department decided to restart the case at the statewide level. In December 2021, a special investigation team was formed, led by Inspector Mark Delaney, a former FBI investigator who had handled many cold cases in the Northwest. Delaney was described as meticulous, calm, with a cautious habit bordering on obsession. He arrived in Olympia on a cloudy morning, carrying a thick file folder, and his first sentence, when meeting Monroe, was, "We won't stop at identity, I want to know where Evelyn is." Delaney immediately had the entire file digitized, rearranged the timeline and witnesses. He read hundreds of pages of old reports, from David Rourke's 1974 minutes to Monroe's updates. To him, this case was a puzzle missing the centerpiece. Whitmore's DNA was the starting point, but not the end. To understand what happened, he needed to find the real person behind Harold Whitmore. He and Monroe went to Yakima County, where Whitmore was born, then to Oregon, where he had lived for 2 decades. They met old neighbors, landlords, construction colleagues. Everyone described Whitmore as a quiet man, somewhat reclusive, not close to anyone. A man named Ray Miller, who worked with him in 1975, remembered that Whitmore often avoided talking about his past in Olympia. "He smoked Pall Malls all day," Ray recounted, "and once when drunk said that I made a big mistake." That statement was recorded in the investigation notebook, marked in red. Next, Delaney went to the town of Caldwell, Idaho, where Whitmore died in 2004. The death record showed he lived in a small rented house, no relatives, discovered dead by the landlord after several days. In the remaining belongings, local police at the time only listed a few miscellaneous items, nothing noteworthy. Delaney requested reopening the storage and rechecking the old evidence. In a dusty wooden box, they discovered a metal keychain engraved with EH, 1973. Although not yet confirmed, Monroe immediately recognized that this matched Evelyn Hartley's initials. The keychain was sent to the forensics lab. The results showed weak female DNA traces, but heavily degraded due to time. Although not absolutely confirmed, the partial match with Evelyn's DNA profile further strengthened the hypothesis that Whitmore had kept something belonging to her. Delaney said little, only noting in the report, "No doubt Whitmore had direct connection with the victim." However, what he cared about more was the motive. He reviewed cases around Olympia in the same period, attacks, disappearances, or home intrusions without resolution. Surprisingly, there were 2 cases of women being stalked in an area less than 2 miles from Evelyn's house, just weeks before she disappeared. Both described a middle-aged man, brown hair, thin, driving an old Chevy pickup, the same type of vehicle Whitmore owned. Although there wasn't enough evidence to arrest at the time, those statements now held special value. As the pieces began to fit, Delaney realized this was not just a random disappearance, but possibly a deliberate act. He believed Whitmore had stalked Evelyn, sought an opportunity to approach, and used the acquaintance to lure her out. What he needed now was to determine where Whitmore had taken her. At the end of January 2022, Delaney formed a new search team, coordinating with the state's search and rescue unit, resurveying the entire area around Lake Fair Drive and the southern edge of Olympia, where Whitmore had once rented a house. If he hid her, he did it in a familiar place, he said in the meeting. Everyone nodded, and the campaign began. Nearly half a century later, the shadows of 2 men, Rourke from back then and Delaney today, seemed to connect on the same journey. One had kept the cigarette filter with the note "Keep for the future," and the other was now stepping forward, using it to trace back time. The official investigation entered a new phase, the phase of finding the final traces of Evelyn Hartley. While the new search team was just beginning to scour the southern area of Olympia, Inspector Mark Delaney continued to cross-reference the old witness statements, particularly the testimony of the 1974 neighbor, Robert Kelton, who had said that he heard a car drive by on the evening Evelyn disappeared. That statement had been dismissed as insignificant at the time, but to Delaney, the detail was worth revisiting. If Whitmore had ever come to Evelyn's house, it's very likely that Kelton, living just 2 houses away, had seen more than he let on. He had the team recheck their old residency records for Mr. Kelton. Robert had passed away in 1999, but his son, Thomas Kelton, now about 60 years old, still lived in Olympia, in his father's old house. Delaney and Lisa Monroe went to meet him one winter morning. Thomas was guarded when talking about the past, but when he saw the old photo of Evelyn, his eyes changed. "I remember," he said softly. "That night I was only 12 years old. Dad told me to go inside because there was a stranger out there." The statement immediately caught Delaney's attention. Thomas recounted that it was raining that night, around 7-something, the boy standing in the living room, looking out the window, and seeing headlights splashing across the wet road. "I saw a man talking to Miss Hartley at her back gate," he said. "They weren't arguing, they were just standing very close to each other. Then my dad pulled the curtains down and said I shouldn't look." The boy had been too young to understand back then, and his father had probably been afraid of getting involved, so he stayed silent. Monroe pulled out the old photo spread of suspect Whitmore and showed it to him. Thomas looked intently and nodded. "Looks just like him. Dark hair, tall build, wearing a green coat." The testimony matched perfectly with the description from witness Leo Kramer years ago. Delaney understood right away. This was the piece of the puzzle they hadn't had for the past 47 years. From the new account, the investigative team reconstructed a map of the Kelton house, the Hartley house, and the woods behind the lake. The distance between the 2 backyards was only about 40 meters, connected to a path leading to the edge of the Percival Creek forest. If Whitmore wanted to take Evelyn away without anyone noticing, this was the most convenient route. Delaney immediately requested that the search and rescue team expand the search in that direction. Meanwhile, Monroe continued investigating the Kelton family. She discovered a noteworthy detail. Robert Kelton had once hired Whitmore to fix plumbing before Evelyn disappeared. They knew each other casually, and Whitmore had even come to the Kelton house just a few days before the incident. This connection made the picture even clearer. Whitmore didn't just know Evelyn through work. He also had a reason to come and go in the neighborhood without raising suspicion. On February 12, 2022, the search team began scouring the woods behind the old row of houses. The metal detector picked up many small metal fragments, soda cans, rusty nails, normal traces in an abandoned area. But toward the end of the day, one team member spotted something protruding from the ground, near the base of a large oak tree, a piece of dark green fabric that had rotted, identified as possibly a woman's raincoat from the 1970s. The fabric sample was immediately sent to the lab for analysis. The fiber analysis results showed that the color and material matched the description of the coat Evelyn was wearing the night she disappeared. Not only that, in the remaining trim, there were a few epithelial cells, enough to determine DNA. When compared, The results matched Evelyn Hartley's DNA sample exactly. That evidence confirmed she had been in the woods behind the Kelton house. Delaney stood silently in front of the report, then said slowly, "So Robert Kelton didn't just hear a car, he knew something, he might have seen more." Even though Robert had passed away, his son's provision of new testimony, along with the discovery of the raincoat, was a major breakthrough. The police could now assert that Evelyn had left her own house, going with Whitmore toward the woods. The remaining question, how far had she gone, and what happened after that? Delaney directed the expansion of the search area by another 2 miles around Percival Creek. The new map was spread out on the table, with red circles marking each suspicious location. Olympia was once again living in an atmosphere of anticipation, this time not the hope of finding someone alive, but the desire to find answers. After nearly half a century, the Kelton trace, thought to be small and faint, had pulled the entire case out of the shadows. And for Delaney, he knew that from here, the journey would no longer be just about tracking down the perpetrator, but about finding where Evelyn Hartley had rested for nearly 50 years. When the lab results confirmed that the raincoat found in the woods was indeed Evelyn Hartley's, Inspector Mark Delaney immediately ordered a review of all the 1974 witness statements. The new evidence raised a big question: if she was taken through the woods behind the house, why didn't anyone in the neighborhood hear or see anything? Delaney believed that among the dozens of old statements, there had to be pieces that were overlooked or deliberately blurred. For the entire week after that, he and Lisa Monroe sat in the records room, reading through every typed page of the transcripts. Most witnesses repeated the same content, heard the rain, didn't see anything unusual. But when they got to Robert Kelton's statement, the neighbor who had said just heard a car drive by, Delaney paused. He noticed that the time detail in the first statement, 7:30 p.m., didn't match witness Leo Kramer's account, saw the strange car at 7 o'clock. The 30-minute discrepancy seemed small, but in a disappearance case, that's enough time for everything to happen. Monroe found a supplemental transcript prepared 3 days after the incident, in which Robert changed his statement. He said he heard a noise, instead of mentioning the car anymore. This transcript was signed without a witness. When cross-referenced with signatures and other documents, Delaney discovered differences in the handwriting. The handwriting in the supplement was shakier, smaller, almost scrawled. That made him suspect that someone had asked Robert to adjust his statement after the fact. Delaney sought out Thomas Kelton again, his son, to verify. When asked, Thomas was silent for a long time, then said, "I think my dad was afraid of something." After that night, he changed the locks, boarded up the back windows, and never mentioned Evelyn again. Thomas recounted that a few days after the disappearance, Whitmore had come to their house once, saying he was picking up tools he forgot. Robert went to open the door, the two men talked briefly, then Whitmore left. Thomas remembered very clearly the look on his father's face when he turned back, frightened and exhausted. This story had never appeared in the original records. Clearly, Robert Kelton had contact with Whitmore after the disappearance, but never reported it to the police. Delaney believed that very moment was what made him silent for the rest of his life. He might have suspected Whitmore's involvement, but he might also have known for sure something, and chosen to hide it to protect his family. When cross-referencing the old investigation records again, Monroe discovered another contradiction. The time and date of the scene check in the police's first report didn't match the weather description in the photos. The report noted light rain, damp, but the photos showed dry ground, leaves not yet wet. The tech lab later confirmed the photo was taken the next morning, not the night of the incident. This meant the scene had been disturbed before it was officially documented. Possibly someone had returned, cleaned up or moved evidence. Both details, the changed statement, and the mismatched scene, both pointed to one spot, the Kelton house. Delaney realized that this family had been in a prime position to see or hear the entire incident, but they were the quietest ones. He didn't believe they were directly involved, but they definitely knew something they didn't dare say at the time. To verify, Delaney had the area map reanalyzed based on modern satellite imagery, reconstructing the positions of the houses, fences, and street light directions in 1974. The simulation results showed from the Kelton house window, one could clearly see Evelyn's backyard if the porch light was on. This matched perfectly with Thomas's account, that I saw them standing talking at the gate. As the facts gradually strung together, Delaney concluded, the disappearance didn't happen in silence, as people once believed. That night, someone saw, someone heard. It's just that all the testimonies were buried by fear. A neighbor might have known who Evelyn went with, but time, fear, and the death of witnesses had buried the truth along with them. Now, with the raincoat found, and the contradictions gradually coming to light, Delaney knew he was closer than ever. But he also understood that this case wasn't just a logic puzzle, it was a chain of human decisions, where every word, every silence had its price. And in Evelyn Hartley's case, that silence had lasted nearly half a century. A few weeks after discovering the contradictions in the old statements, the Washington State Forensics Lab sent a new report to the Olympia Police Department. Detailed analysis results from the raincoat found in Percival Creek Woods. Inspector Mark Delaney opened the file in the quiet room, the smell of fresh paper mingling with the bitter scent of coffee. The first line stunned him: secondary DNA sample on the collar matches the genetic profile of Harold Whitmore. That was the final piece Delaney had been waiting for. If the Pall Mall cigarette filter only proved Whitmore had been near Evelyn's house, now the raincoat confirmed direct contact between the two. The results clearly stated, male epithelial cells stuck to the collar and outer sleeve, mixed with the victim's female DNA, a pattern characteristic of forceful physical contact, like grabbing, pulling, or shoving. Under the microscope, the fabric was stained with mud and sand microcrystals from the Capitol Lake area, indicating the coat was soiled that very night she disappeared. The report also noted another detail that sent chills down Monroe's spine. On the flap, there was a small V-shaped tear, with the fiber edges pulled backward, likely caused by a metal object, matching the EH 1973 keychain found in Whitmore's belongings in Idaho. The lab concluded both items had likely been in direct contact. The chemical match, fiber structure, and soil dust made the chance of coincidence nearly zero. Delaney sat silently looking at the old crime scene photos, the damp backyard, low wooden fence, yellow light spilling on puddles. Everything now fit together. Whitmore standing outside the fence, meeting Evelyn as she just got home, them talking in the rain, possibly arguing, then he pulled her toward the woods. In the struggle, her coat tore, he left behind the cigarette, and never came back. The lab results also clarified another point that no one had explained for nearly half a century. On the raincoat, there were traces of reddish-brown animal hair, identified as from a retriever breed dog. When reviewing Whitmore's records again, Monroe found information that he had once owned a dog named Buddy, the exact retriever breed, who often followed him to job sites. That tiny trace, after nearly 50 years, now became chillingly authentic evidence. On March 10, 2022, an internal meeting was held at the Olympia Police Headquarters. On the large screen, Monroe presented the DNA results, image comparisons, and data. The meeting room was deathly silent. When she finished, Delaney stood up, his voice low. We can affirm that Harold Whitmore is responsible for Evelyn Hartley's disappearance. No one objected. After so many years, the case finally had its perpetrator, though he had been dead for a long time. But for Delaney, that joy wasn't complete. He knew there was still one unanswered question: where was Evelyn's body? All the physical evidence had pointed to the perpetrator, but still hadn't pointed to where she was buried. That would be the hardest part, and also the final closure he had to find no matter what, to close the mystery that had lasted nearly half a century, and bring Evelyn Hartley back to her family, even if only in memory and belated justice. When the new forensic results confirmed Harold Whitmore's DNA on Evelyn Hartley's raincoat, Inspector Mark Delaney thought the case was closed. But while reviewing the files again, one detail made him pause. A second male DNA sequence appeared on the collar, weaker but completely different from Whitmore's. A quick comparison showed this trace didn't belong to the victim and didn't match any data in the state's DNA database. Delaney had a hunch that something wasn't finished. Maybe Whitmore hadn't acted alone. He ordered a review of all of Whitmore's relationships, especially the last person confirmed to have seen him before he left Olympia. The first name that came up was Robert Kelton, the neighbor who lived right near Evelyn's house, who had hired Whitmore to fix plumbing, and according to his son's statement, had seen him again a few days after she disappeared. This testimony had been overlooked before, but now, with the new DNA sequence, Delaney believed that man knew more than he'd ever said. The investigative team dug into Robert Kelton's old archived records. Though he had died in 1999, his son Thomas Kelton's DNA sample was still on file from a witness comparison process. When the secondary DNA sequence was compared to this record, the result matched 50%, enough to conclude that the trace belonged to Thomas's father, Robert Kelton. The Olympia Police Department's conference room fell silent. After nearly half a century, they discovered that the neighbor who had only heard a car drive by not only knew about it, but had been at the scene. Delaney reread every line of the report, his voice hoarse. He wasn't just a witness. From what they had, he pieced together a new hypothesis. Whitmore might not have subdued Evelyn on his own. He needed help, someone familiar with the neighborhood, who knew her habits, who could create an opportunity to approach without raising suspicion. Robert Kelton, the friendly neighbor, fit that description perfectly. Police believed that on the evening of October 12, 1974, Whitmore went to Kelton's house, asked for help fixing a broken plumbing section, and mentioned talking to the neighbor girl Hartley. Robert may have agreed, gone with him to Evelyn's house, or at least witnessed the whole thing without intervening. His DNA on the raincoat, along with the shoe prints discovered in old photos, proved he had direct contact with the victim, though the extent remained unclear. On March 18, 2022, the Thurston County Prosecutor's Office held a press conference, announcing the decision to file posthumous charges against Harold Whitmore, while issuing an arrest warrant for Robert's son Thomas Kelton, on charges of concealing evidence and obstructing the investigation. Though Robert was dead, state law allowed civil proceedings to clarify his role as an accomplice. Police believed he had helped Whitmore hide Evelyn's body, then stayed silent for the rest of his life. When Delaney and Monroe arrived at Thomas's house to serve the arrest warrant, he didn't seem surprised. "I knew this day would come," he said quietly. "My dad took that secret to his grave." Thomas confessed that, while cleaning the storage room in 1985, he found an old shovel with a wooden handle carved HW. When he asked his father, he only said, "Don't touch the past." Thomas had never dared report it to police for fear of tarnishing the family name. Now, with everything out in the open, he agreed to cooperate, leading the investigative team to the wooded area behind the house, where they had once found the raincoat. Delaney stood looking at the quiet patch of land amid the Percival Creek forest, feeling both triumphant and heavy. After 48 years, they had named the two men who had buried the truth: Whitmore, the perpetrator, and Kelton, the silent one. That handshake between them back then had traded for half a century of torment for the entire community. As Thomas was led away, he turned back to look at the old house, his voice trembling. "If you find her, let me light a candle." Delaney nodded, closing the notebook. The case had entered its final chapter, the chapter of truth, where every smallest trace came back, forcing those who had once stayed silent to face the darkness they had helped create. On the afternoon of March 19, 2022, nearly 48 years after the night Evelyn Hartley disappeared, Thomas Kelton sat in an interrogation room at the Olympia Police Department. The small room, with cold white light shining down on his face, now etched with deep wrinkles, eyes red from sleeplessness. In front of him were Inspector Mark Delaney and Lisa Monroe, who stayed silent for the first few minutes, letting him confront the weight of the space on his own. Finally, Delaney spoke, his voice even and low. "Thomas, you're not the one who committed the crime. But you know something, and you've kept it for nearly half a century. We need the truth." Thomas was silent for a long time, his hands clasped together, trembling slightly. "I can't keep it anymore," he said quietly. "I've lived with this my whole life." He took a deep breath, then told them. On the night of October 12, 1974, he was only 12 years old. Around 7 in the evening, with steady rain falling, his father, Robert Kelton, was talking to a strange man on the porch, whom he later learned was Harold Whitmore. The two spoke softly, tensely. When Whitmore left, Robert told his son to stay home, while he went over to talk to Miss Hartley about the plumbing. Thomas watched through the window, seeing his father and the other man head toward Evelyn's house. The light on her porch came on, then snapped off. A while later, only the car's headlights shone on the road. According to Thomas, his father returned more than an hour later, soaked, hands shaking. He said nothing, just told his son to go to bed. The next morning, Robert got up early, taking the old shovel out toward the Percival Creek forest. "I asked where he was going, and he just set out back to help bury a dead dog." It was many years later that Thomas understood the real meaning of those words. He remembered clearly the smell of mud, the mud-caked boots, and his father's eyes that wouldn't look straight at his son. Delaney asked, "Did you ever hear your father mention Whitmore after that?" Thomas nodded. "Yes, once. He said Whitmore had cleaned up and no one would find out. My dad was afraid of him." "I know." Whitmore came to the house a few days later. They argued quietly in the kitchen. Then he left. "That night, my dad burned something in the backyard. I saw the fire reflecting through the curtains. Monroe placed an old photo on the table, the green raincoat found in the forest. Do you recognize this? Thomas looked at it for a long time, then nodded. I saw that coat in our garage, right after the week of the disappearance. Mom asked, and Dad said he picked it up off the road. Later, when we moved, I didn't see it anymore. That statement made the room freeze. Monroe gripped her pen lightly, her eyes meeting Delaney's. They had indirect confirmation that Robert Kelton had once stored the victim's belongings. When asked why he waited until now to speak up, Thomas bowed his head, his voice choking. I hate myself. I was scared just like him. I thought if I stayed silent, the past would disappear. But every time I hear rain falling, I remember that night. He paused, wiping his face with a tissue, then continued. I don't know what Whitmore did to her, just that my dad helped him. I remember him saying, she was pitiful, but I already did it. Delaney sat up straight, his voice gentle but firm. Thomas, you've done the right thing by speaking out. We won't make you bear someone else's guilt. He signed the statement transcript, confirming its full contents. According to it, police officially concluded that Robert Kelton had assisted Harold Whitmore in concealing Evelyn Hartley's body, while Thomas was only an indirect witness, not a participant. After signing, Thomas looked through the one-way mirror, where the light reflected off the gray ceiling. My dad once said, the truth will find its own way. Maybe, he was right. Delaney folded the file, stood up. The interrogation ended, but in his heart, a mix of relief and bitterness intertwined. Nearly half a century had passed. Everyone involved was gone, leaving only memories, DNA and a belated confession, but enough to close the most mysterious part of the case. Now the only thing left was to find where Whitmore and Kelton had buried Evelyn, so that finally, after 48 years, she could return to the light and her name be cleared forever. 3 days after Thomas Kelton's confession, a special search team was redeployed to the Percival Creek Forest area, where Evelyn Hartley's raincoat had once been found. This time, they had specific guidance. Thomas pointed to a low-lying patch of ground near the creek bank, where his father had gone on rainy mornings in 1974. He said that was the place to bury the dead dog. Thomas said, his voice shaking. What he described matched the geological maps from that year. Clay sand soil, damp and prone to subsidence, perfect for quick digging and covering. On the morning of March 22, 2022, Olympia's sky was overcast, thick fog blanketing everything. The forensics team set up barriers around the area, technicians meticulously digging layer by layer, using ground-penetrating scanners and soil-penetrating radar to locate. After nearly 4 hours, the screen showed an anomaly about a meter below the surface. Delaney stood nearby, clutching his worn leather notebook, in which he had recorded the entire journey over the past year. When the final layer of soil was removed, yellow light fell on something ivory pale, a fragment of human skull, accompanied by dark fabric scraps and a rusted metal keychain. No one said a word. Everyone knew they had found Evelyn. The rest of the remains were exhumed carefully. The skeleton was nearly intact, lying on its side, arms folded against the chest. Beside it was an old rubber cord, possibly used for binding. The keychain fragment was identified as the E1973 inches that had belonged to the victim, matching perfectly with the photo in her personal file. When the DNA results came back, it matched completely with Evelyn's mother's genetic sample preserved from 1974. Nearly half a century had passed, and the young girl had finally been found. News spread quickly throughout Olympia. The Olympian newspaper ran the headline, Evelyn Hartley's remains found after 48 years missing. People who had lived through that time stopped at newsstands, silent. In Tacoma, Margaret Reed, Evelyn's sister, burst into tears upon receiving the police call. She only said, "Thank you for bringing my sister home." That afternoon, Delaney and Monroe stood at the site, watching the faint late-day sunlight filter through the trees. Wind blew through the forest, carrying the scent of damp earth and decaying grass. Everything was so quiet that the sound of water flowing under the creek bed could be clearly heard. Nearly half a century, Monroe said softly, and it all started from just a cigarette filter. Delaney nodded, his gaze distant. He knew that in that moment, justice, though belated, had been named. Evelyn's remains were taken to the lab to complete forensic procedures, then returned to the family for burial. A small ceremony was held at Forest Memorial Cemetery, attended only by a few relatives and the investigators who had worked the case. No trumpets, no media, just candlelight and white tulips. On the new headstone was engraved Evelyn Hartley, 1947, 1974, finally home. As everyone left, Delaney stayed last, looking around the forest that had closed a 48-year story. Justice never gets lost, he said quietly. It just needs enough time to be found. Cold wind rustled through the trees, dry leaves rustling softly, like a response from the girl who now rested in peace. The discovery of Evelyn Hartley's remains closed half a century of searching, but for Inspector Mark Delaney, the journey wasn't over. He knew that to bring true justice, the case had to go to trial, even though one of the two suspects, Harold Whitmore, had died in 2004. Washington's legal system allowed for a posthumous criminal responsibility hearing in special cases, to record evidence, and affirm the victim's vindication. Delaney teamed up with Thurston County Prosecutor Emily Carver to prepare the file. Alongside that, Thomas Kelton, the son of the accomplice neighbor, would face trial for concealing evidence and obstructing justice. From April 2022, the investigative team began compiling all physical evidence: the Pall Mall cigarette filter, raincoat, keychain, soil samples, DNA records, along with Thomas's confession. The forensics lab produced a comprehensive report over 400 pages long, including histological analysis, fiber traces, ground-penetrating images from the burial site, and weather comparisons with 1974 photos. Everything matched perfectly, forming an airtight chain of evidence, irrefutable. Meanwhile, Prosecutor Carver faced a tough legal puzzle. Whitmore was dead, so he couldn't be tried in the usual process. She chose the path of a posthumous legal declaration, for the court to publicly recognize him as the perpetrator based on DNA evidence, while restoring the victim's honor. This was a rare procedure, requiring the entire file to be absolutely accurate, and approved by the Washington State Superior Court. The first meeting between Delaney and Carver lasted until midnight. The table was piled with crime scene photos, Percival Creek forest maps, and scribbled notes. Carver asked, "Are you sure we have enough to charge Robert Kelton, even though he's dead?" Delaney nodded. "We don't need to charge him. Just prove that his silence kept Evelyn from being found for 48 years. Justice takes many forms. This is one of them." While the legal team prepared for the Whitmore part, police focused on trying Thomas Kelton. Though he had cooperated, the obstruction charge still had to be brought publicly. His statement was the key that unlocked the entire case, and Delaney wanted it presented to the jury, so everyone could understand that it wasn't just a crime, but a story of fear, silence, and consequences stretching nearly half a century. In the following weeks, Delaney and Monroe visited Margaret Reed, Evelyn's sister, to inform her of the trial plans. She was over 70, with silver hair, deep-set eyes. Upon hearing the news, she just smiled faintly. "I don't need anyone punished anymore. I just want my sister called by her right name, not the missing girls anymore." Delaney held her hand, promising the court would do that. Early June 2022, the Washington Superior Court officially approved the request for a delayed justice hearing titled State of Washington vs. Harold Whitmore Posthumous. Statewide media quickly covered it, calling it one of the most thoroughly re-investigated cold cases in state history. The press dubbed it the Olympia miracle, the miracle of persistence. The night before the hearing, Delaney didn't sleep. He sat alone in his office, looking at a 1973 black and white photo of Evelyn, the young girl with a gentle smile, peaceful eyes. He understood this trial wasn't to punish the dead, but to affirm that time couldn't erase responsibility. Every action leaves a trace, he told himself, and justice, though late, still finds its way back. On the morning of June 14, the large Olympia courtroom was packed. The prosecutor's office presented the entire chain of evidence: the cigarette filter with Whitmore's DNA, the raincoat with contact traces, the keychain fragment matching his belongings, along with the body identification results. Old images were projected on the screen: the wooden fence photo, the rain-slicked road, the Percival Creek forest map. The room was deathly silent. When the prosecutor read the conclusion, "Harold Whitmore, born 1949, is determined to be the perpetrator of Evelyn Hartley's death in 1974, Margaret burst into tears. She didn't cry from hatred, but because her sister had finally been heard. Immediately after, the court moved to Thomas Kelton's trial. At the stand he bowed his head, voice hoarse. I don't ask for forgiveness, just hope everyone understands that my dad was afraid, and so was I. But our silence was a sin. I accept responsibility." The room fell quiet. The prosecution recommended leniency for his full cooperation and help in finding the victim's remains. The judge sentenced him to 18 months probation, plus community service time, and concluded, "Thomas Kelton, thanks to you the truth was found, but your father's silence is a lesson for all." When the trial ended, Delaney went outside, standing on the Superior Court steps looking at the bright Olympia sky. He knew Evelyn Hartley's case had now reached its conclusion, not through revenge, but through confirmation that justice, even after 48 years late, was still justice. On his desk, the final file marked Case 74-2, Hartley, Evelyn was closed. On the cover was a handwritten note from Delaney, "Closed, no one forgotten." And somewhere across Capitol Lake, wind blew through the trees, carrying a very faint sound, like thanks from the young girl who had finally come home. In August 2022, the Evelyn Hartley case was transferred to the Federal District Court in Tacoma for the final justice hearing, to officially record the post-conviction criminal judgment against Harold Whitmore and complete the civil proceedings related to the Kelton family. The trial was held in a historic brick building overlooking Commencement Bay, where the sea breeze carried a chill through the old glass panes. Even though the defendant was dead, hundreds of people still came to observe: reporters, law students, Olympia residents, and even those who had participated in the search years ago. They came not to witness a judgment, but to hear the final story of a case that had dragged on for nearly half a century. Detective Mark Delaney sat in the front row with Lisa Monroe and prosecutor Emily Carver. Beside them, Margaret Reed, Evelyn's sister, clutched an old photo of her, taken in 1973, with a clear gaze, blue eyes looking straight at the camera. When the gavel sounded, the courtroom fell silent. Judge Elena Dorsey, who presided over the trial, began, "Today, this court is not judging a man, but a shadow that has covered 48 years, and our task is to restore the name to the one time stole away." Prosecutor Carver began her presentation in a low but firm voice. She went through the entire journey, from the Pall Mall cigarette filter, the DNA match with Whitmore, to the raincoat, the keychain, and finally Evelyn's body. Each piece of evidence was projected on the large screen, each detail a fragment of time closing. When Carver spoke of Thomas Kelton's confession, that his father had helped Whitmore hide the body, not a few in the courtroom bowed their heads, silent. It was Thomas Kelton's turn to take the witness stand, his face gaunt, his steps slow. He repeated his confession, this time before the public. "I knew for a long time, but I stayed silent. My father said it was grown-up business. I've carried that burden my whole life. And now, I speak for him, we were wrong." In that moment, no one saw accomplice anymore, only a son who had finally released the burden his father left behind. Delaney was called as the final witness. He recounted the investigation process, from the old evidence locker to the day the body was found. When he mentioned the note from the late Sheriff Rourke, "Keep for the future," his voice choked. "That future has come," Delaney said, "and justice, though late, has found its way back." The entire room stood and applauded as he finished his testimony. Judge Dorsey read the verdict in a solemn atmosphere. She declared Harold Whitmore the sole perpetrator of Evelyn Hartley's death, recording posthumous criminal responsibility, and ordering the case file closed. As for Robert Kelton, the court determined he had engaged in complicity in concealing the body, but since he had passed away, the case ended at the level of legal confirmation. Thomas Kelton was declared exempt from prison, to continue community service, as a way to atone for what time could not repair. As the trial ended, the afternoon breeze blew through the tall windows. Margaret stepped close to the bench, placing her sister's photo on the wooden table before the judge. "Now my sister can rest in peace," she said softly. She turned to Delaney, gripping his hand tightly. "Thank you for not giving up." He only replied softly, "No one deserves to be forgotten." That afternoon, as people left the courthouse, the sunset gilded the entire Tacoma Bay. Delaney paused on the steps, looking at the sparkling water. In the sea wind he seemed to hear a whisper, "Thank you." Perhaps it was Evelyn, the girl who had gone through 48 years of silence, to finally be called by her true name in the light of justice. The verdict in Tacoma quickly became the focus of media across the state of Washington. That evening, the King 5 News broadcast opened with the ticker, "Justice after 48 years, Harold Whitmore identified as perpetrator in Evelyn Hartley case." The story was replayed many times, not for its sensationalism, but for its meaning, a case thought buried in the dust of time, finally closed thanks to the perseverance of people who refused to forget. Prosecutor Emily Carver stated after the trial, "This is not just a victory for the justice system, but a victory for memory and faith. We have proven that time cannot blur the truth." Many forensic and criminal investigation agencies in the state sent congratulations, viewing the Evelyn Hartley case as a model for applying DNA technology and genealogical analysis in cold case investigations. In Olympia, the local radio station replayed an old news clip from 1974, a short interview when Evelyn had just gone missing, her mother's trembling voice, saying she only hoped my daughter won't be forgotten. Nearly half a century later, that prayer had come true. Old neighbors of the Hartley family recounted that many had brought flowers to the front of the house on Maple Drive, where the disappearance began. An elderly woman placed a small sign at the gate with the words, "We remember you, Evelyn." The public's reaction was largely emotional and admiring. On social media, thousands of comments shared the story, many writing that they saw it as a reminder that justice is never lost, only temporarily forgotten. Others expressed sympathy for Thomas Kelton, saying he was brave to break his family's long silence. The Seattle Times called him the final witness to the shadow, while a journalist wrote, "Thomas is not forgiven, but he has been freed." For Detective Mark Delaney, the verdict brought not a sense of triumph, but closure. He said in the post-trial press conference, "None of us are joyful. We're just relieved that Evelyn has finally been called by her right name." His face was etched with fatigue, but his eyes lit up when he spoke of the investigation team's perseverance. "I just continued the work of those who started before me. Without them keeping the old evidence samples, we wouldn't have anything today." 2 weeks later, Margaret Reed held a small memorial by Capitol Lake, where Evelyn used to jog regularly. Only about a few dozen people came, police, old neighbors, a few young students. They lit candles, read Evelyn's name, and released flowers onto the still water. When asked her feelings, Margaret said slowly, "Justice can't make me forget the pain, but it lets me let go. I no longer have to wonder why every night." That night, Olympia sank into quiet. On the porch of the old Hartley family home, the lamp that Margaret had faithfully replaced for many years still shone. That light no longer carried hopeless waiting, but became a symbol of endurance, the thing that helped a girl forgotten in the 1974 rain be found, and a community reminded that justice may come late, but it always finds its way back. After the trial in Tacoma, the city of Olympia returned to its daily rhythm, but the Evelyn Hartley case still left deep ripples in the community. In the newspapers, the editorial sections in the following days were filled with articles about the meaning of late truth. Those who had lived through the 1970s recounted that they still remembered very clearly the rainy night Evelyn disappeared, when police knocked on every door, when the radio broadcast Olympia teenager missing. Many admitted they once believed the case would never be solved, and the final execution of justice left them both moved and unsettled. A local reporter wrote, "Evelyn's death was not just a family's tragedy, but a mirror reflecting a community's fear and silence." At the Olympia Police Department headquarters, Case File 74-102 Hartley, Evelyn was placed in the Cold Case Resolved exhibit, next to other famous cases from Washington state. Evelyn's black and white photo, with her delicate face and gentle eyes, was framed in glass under the caption, "48 years from missing to justice." Young new investigators always paused for a few seconds when passing by, as a reminder that their work was not just solving crimes, but restoring names to those who had been forgotten. For Detective Mark Delaney, the aftermath of the case still followed him every time he saw rain falling. He submitted early retirement papers a few months after the verdict, saying it's time for the young ones to continue. In his farewell meeting, Delaney told his colleagues that what he remembered most was not the moment of finding evidence or the courtroom victory, but the instant standing in Percival Creek Woods, when the light shone on the first bone fragment. Then he said, "I realize justice is not just catching the guilty, it's making someone seen as the person they once were." Lisa Monroe continued her work, but she kept a photocopy of the Hartley case file in her desk drawer. In a later interview, she said, "I think we didn't really solve the case. Evelyn led the way for us. She never left." That statement was repeated by many in articles, becoming a symbol of faith in delayed justice. In Tacoma, Margaret Reed still lived in her small house by the bay. On the altar was Evelyn's portrait, next to the old EHR 1973 keychain fragment that the police returned after the trial. She no longer hung the missing sign on the porch, replacing it with a wooden plaque engraved "Home at Last." Every year on October 12, she still brought flowers to Capitol Lake, releasing them onto the still water. Local people called it the ritual of memory, and many young people she didn't know also came, placing white tulips by the lake shore. In 2023, the city of Olympia officially named a walking trail around the lake Evelyn's Path. The small sign at the trailhead read, "For the girl who never got to come back, and for those who never stopped searching for her." On rainy afternoons, when mist blurred the water's surface, people could still see the light from the old Hartley family home reflecting on the lake, that enduring light through half a century. It was no longer a light of waiting, but of memory, reminding all that justice may come late, but the memory of truth never fades. The story of Evelyn Hartley is not only a criminal case solved after nearly half a century, but also a profound mirror reflecting the enduring values in American society: faith in justice, the power of memory, and community responsibility. In the modern world, where news changes every minute, and the past is easily forgotten, the journey to find the truth for Evelyn reminds us that justice never comes quickly, but is the result of perseverance and human compassion for one another. Without the dedication of Detective Mark Delaney, the courage of Thomas Kelton in admitting the truth, or the lamp that Margaret Reed still lights every night for 48 years, that case might have remained forever silent in old files. In today's life, when we witness injustices, voices drowned in silence or prejudice, that story reminds us that each person has a responsibility to speak up, even if late, because the truth is only revived when someone dares to call its name. It also shows the power of technology and humanity when they go hand in hand. DNA, genealogy, and modern forensic science only truly come into play when guided by a heart that refuses to forget. From Olympia to Tacoma, the light still shines on Evelyn's porch, as a reminder to everyone that justice is not measured by time, but by the relentless efforts of those who believe that every person, even the deceased, deserves to be heard, remembered, and called by their true name. Thank you for following the journey to bring Evelyn Hartley back to the light, after nearly half a century of being forgotten, a testament that justice never sleeps. Please subscribe to the channel to join us in continuing to explore cases that seem to have sunk into the past, where the truth is still waiting to be revealed in the next video.